Welcome to Jerusalem Unplugged, the only podcast dedicated to Jerusalem, its history, and its people. Your host, Roberto Mazza, will bring you guests discussing their relationship with the Holy City. A journey through history, society, feelings, and hopes for the future. Follow the podcast on all social media platforms at Jerusalem Unplugged.
Hi, I am Roberto Mazza, and this is Jerusalem Unplugged, your getaway into the multi-layered narratives of this iconic city. Each episode, I'll guide you through Jerusalem's mesmerizing chronicles and present-day reality. With leading experts as guests, we'll examine the city's intricate past, raging social-political debates, and nuances of its cosmopolitan culture. Let this podcast be your immersive audio expedition, allowing you to experience the spiritual resonance, political tensions, and dynamic voices define Jerusalem's powerful mystery. Join me on this thought-provoking journey. Today, my guest is Yair Agmon. Yair is a Jerusalem, an artist and a scholar. Yair is the author of a number of short movies, some of them award-winning short movies like Heroes, Once Upon a School, A Tale of Two Pandemics, or The Arrest. However, Yair has shifted his career and his attention and is now writing a PhD dissertation at the University of California in Los Angeles, dwelling on the past, memory, discard, and dispossession at the City of David National Park. And essentially he's exploring how settlers in East Jerusalem use memory to give purpose and meaning to their territorial project in Palestinian East Jerusalem. With Yair, we discussed his work, but we also discussed important terms in colonialism, apartheid, and the question of memory and how memory is used for political purposes. Lastly, Yair is the author of an upcoming article that will be published with Jerusalem Quarterly, From Wasteland to Eden, on temporality and the political ecology of East Jerusalem. First things first, Yair, welcome.
Thank you, Roberto. It's really good to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Now, it's been a long time since I interviewed someone from Jerusalem, given that for a number of episodes, I mostly work with scholars, different parts of the world, of Palestine and Israel, but you were born in Jerusalem. So I want to ask something about yourself and your career. But first of all, I would like to ask, what is your Jerusalem? In other words, what's your connection with the city?
Well, my Jerusalem, I grew up in West Jerusalem, and I went to school in Jerusalem. I did my undergraduate degree in Jerusalem. I have both an intense love for the city as well as a lot of problems with it. It's first of all a segregated city, and it's something that a lot of my Jewish counterparts like to ignore. And for me, I guess the best way to describe Jerusalem for me is, well, okay, I think growing up in Jerusalem, I resented the city very much. It's an intense place. Walking in the street can be quite an aggressive experience. It's quite violent. There's always the fear of violence looming, whether that's settler violence or violence of Jews to Palestinians, or I grew up during the Second Intifada. Also, the fear of violence from the uprisings was also very much present. But more recently, I had a chance to introduce Jerusalem to visitors from other countries. And after a very long period of being mostly frustrated with the city, frustrated with its lack of cultural life, its inability to transcend extremely ethno-nationalist politics, with the immense inequality and poverty that is inflicted upon Palestinian residents of the city, and just like a complete consternation with political solution, I had a chance to also introduce the city to a few friends from abroad. And I was actually quite annoyed to learn that I actually like Jerusalem, that there's so much beautiful things in it, that it is a special place. That something about walking through Nablus Gate all the way to the Western Wall, from the Muslim corner, the Armenian corner, the Jewish corner, is a unique experience. There's something quite striking walking streets that people have been walking for thousands and thousands of years, and that so many people in the world find their meaning, religious meaning, political meaning through this city. And it really comes to bear when you try to explain the nuances of the city to other people and how everything gets sort of compacted and condensed into the most small and minutiae forms of arguments about what stones to use and where the street lies and whether the roadblock from the IDF is in this particular intersection or that particular intersection. And everything seems like it might explode in a minute, but also there's so much life and vitality to the city that is really unparalleled, I think. And in a very strange way, seeing it change over the last 20 years, seeing the integration of more East Jerusalem Palestinian residents into West Jerusalem has been a process that has been both dumbfounding in many ways, but also very optimistic or interesting to see, at least in my perspective. So it's a city that I both very frustrated with, as well as very much love and care for a lot.
Now, you no longer live in Jerusalem, but you live in LA. And so I want to start sort of talking about your academic interest, discussing your work. And so I've been fascinated by your general career, and we're going to mention that you're an artist. You produced short movies, and I want to talk about them. You're also a photographer. But right now, I just want to focus a little bit on your academic work, because obviously it's deeply connected with Jerusalem and some of the issues that you just mentioned. So can you give us a sense of your current work and how it connects with Jerusalem?
Right. So my research focuses primarily on the city of David, and that's an archaeological site that has over the years been taken over by a private settler organization named El-Ad. And there's a lot of writing about El-Ad as an organization, how it has worked over the past 25 years to slowly encroach into Wadi Khilwa, which is a small neighborhood in East Jerusalem, a Palestinian neighborhood, and how it works in conjunction with Israeli authorities and the municipal government of Jerusalem and other settler organizations to slowly turn East Jerusalem Jewish, right? So on the one hand, that means buying up property, usually through violent means, whether that is legal or not. Some are more legal than others. There's a panoply of strategies they use. But that, on the one hand, that means buying up property, settling Jewish settlers in these homes in the middle of the Palestinian neighborhood. But El-Ad, uniquely, unlike its other organizations that play similar roles in the Israeli colonization network, let's call it, uses heritage to mask its activities, right? So in 1996, it received the authorization to develop and operate a tourist attraction or a visitor center in the archaeological site that we know of as the City of David, which was the oldest or sort of the past iteration of Jerusalem, right? The most ancient remains of Jerusalem, the city, from the Iron Age and the Bronze Age, lie actually on the hill that Wadi Khilwa, this Palestinian neighborhood, inhabits today. So El-Ad has been working over the past 25 years to develop a visitor center that is centered around telling the story of the Jewish nation, how it rose from division and was united into a sovereign kingdom, a sort of marrying of political power with territory. I think that is a very essential part of the story, and how that kingdom essentially is the precursor to the modern Jewish state of Israel. And they have been largely successful in promulgating this narrative and disseminating it, mostly through heritage tourism. So these sort of two prongs of their operation is one of them being the material dispossession of Palestinians from their homes and property, and the other being the sort of taking over of the narrative, right? The erasure of history and the replacing of cultural memory from sort of a multicultural city that has multiple layers of time, multiple empires have ruled over it, multiple people inhabited it, and then sort of homogenizing that narrative into one single arc that leads from ancient times where Jews ruled the city to modern times where Jews again are the rulers of the city. And my work looks at the relationship between these two things, right? So how cultural memory is used both in the symbolic sense as well as in the administrative bureaucracies of the occupation to dispossess Palestinians. And I look at how cultural memory is essentially a tool of dispossession. That is the focus of my dissertation research.
You have a couple of terms here that you mentioned, and one obviously is about the city of David, which you already discussed in archaeological terms. And I was wondering, in your view, what extent the city of David is a reality, so it's a real archaeological site, as opposed to maybe a question of a memory of a site that may have been, or a site that is desired in order to prove a political.
I think it's a really challenging question because on the one hand, and Nadia Abul-Hajj has already shown how archaeology in Israel uses a biblical landscape as a kind of an epistemological framework to begin inquiry into the stratas, into the archaeological findings, by trying to prove the Bible as scientifically correct. And how that is used as a political tool to determine what she calls, right, the borders of the settler nation. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. But looking at archaeology also more seriously, you see that in fact there is a lot of evidence to suggest that a group of people practicing something similar to Judaism, maybe a proto-Judaism, have lived in this place for a very long time. So the archaeological evidence on the one hand suggests that there is a Jewish civilization in place, that some of the stories we get from the Bible have some form of veracity. But at the same time, I think a lot of the narratives and narrations that Elad are offering are not only much more sensational and sort of focus on characters that never existed, like David and Solomon, that we don't know, actually don't have any proof that existed as such, but it does something else, right? It takes whatever proofs of the Bible it kind of is able to extract from the archaeological excavation and wield it as a political tool. I think this is sort of where it gets a little murky, because there is a way in which if we think of the archaeological strata as a way to imagine or understand who lived in the city for the last 2,000 years, then one version of it is that Jews inhabited for a while. But if we look at the strata as a whole, clearly, and this is one huge problem with Elad's work, it omits a lot of the history, right? So Muslim and Christian histories just get literally thrown to the dustbin of history, and we have documented evidence of Elad during excavation taking archaeological findings from Muslim and Christian eras and literally throwing them in the trash, right? So there's sort of erasure by omission as one form of wielding these archaeological evidence, sort of curating very carefully which evidence support the claim of their narrative. But at the same time, I think there's an attempt to build a cultural memory from these evidence that actually has not just to do with the archaeological debate itself. If archaeologists can debate whether Jewish residents of Jerusalem circa the Second Temple were in fact, or should we call them Jewish or not, because they practice some of the some of the practices and religious traditions that we associate today with Judaism, but also practice other things, right? We have evidence of deity worshiping, we have idols, we have non-kosher animals being consumed, we have all these other practices that seem to run against Judaism as we know it today. If we take those into consideration, we might think of this origin story of nationalism quite differently, right? As instead of a formation of a Jewish nation, understand it as an evolution of local practices and local religions that sort of exist along an axis of history in the city, rather than form a particular group and its claim over land. So to go back to your original question, I think the problem with Elad is that some of the archaeology seems to support at least an existence of Jewish history to a certain degree, but it's not so much whether that history is correct or incorrect, but rather the ways it gets mobilized to authorize colonization, violence, dispossession, right? The sort of idea that from this history emanates a territorial claim over property rather than necessarily what happened in history and what kind of people lived and inhabited the city.
And this brings me to ask about the question of memory, because one thing that I found fascinating about memory and the way you described your work, it's the mechanism. So how does the memory becomes this element, tool actually, for dispossession? I mean, I understand the point where you can create, memories, or you can use history, but you're making a different point. So I was wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about this idea of memory connected to dispossession.
Right. I think often we talk about memory or cultural memory as a set of symbolic claims over the past, right? And sort of define ourselves, our identity, our individual and collective identities in relationship to that past, right? Sort of the story of how we got here. And this is how we usually talk about memory. But I think memory also has a very material existence, right? So one side of memory is dispossession, which is what I'm working on, is the ways in which memory, cultural narratives are where cultural memory invests value in certain locations and places, and then that value gets picked up by governmental authorities and private organizations such as Elad to claim that there is a need for memory, right? To sort of inscribe materially into the landscape this particular narrative. And what this gets filtered to or sort of transformed into are actual administrative and bureaucratic tools to claim land, right? So one way to do this is to have a national park. And a national park in Israel, designation to a national park means that development is halted, right? You are not allowed to develop private property on zones zoned for national parks. And Palestinians who reside within this neighborhood, Wadi Shelwa, because it is also designated as a national park, are not allowed to develop their house and allowed to build. However, you are allowed to build if you are developing it for public access, for tourism, right? So Elad is actually allowed to do construction and add more property and add more buildings and territory to their endeavor through this particular administrative tool. But it also means that there's a lot of finances or a lot of money that goes with this, right? Governmental grants go to heritage and memory and cultural memory. We have a Ministry of Heritage in Israel, and that Ministry of Heritage is for Jewish heritage only, which means that Elad is a huge benefactor of these monies that then allows it to invest in infrastructure and allows it to use other monies it receives from donation to buy up property, and so on and so on. And all of this power that it amasses is actually a result of its cultural power, right? Its ability to market to government officials and regulators that this memory, this place, this particular set of material ruins is in fact crucial to the Jewish identity. So through investing value in cultural memory, it's gaining access to the bureaucratic and administrative tools of dispossession, and is able to link the two. And I'm not saying that the cultural erasure that comes with or that Elad is promoting is any less significant. I think it does a lot of damage, and we can see that in the Israeli public in the way they sort of reimagine themselves or reimagine the territory that East Jerusalem is part of West Jerusalem and don't recognize the illegal annexation of these territories. But what my argument is, I'm hoping that my contribution to the field is that these ways of thinking about cultural memory also have very much material ramifications that lead to material dispossession.
Actually, I was thinking about the sort of practical side of what you were saying. And I had a question which I didn't think about when I planned the interview, but it was buzzing in my head. Because if we think about the history of Elad and similar organizations, 20, maybe 30 years ago, this could have been considered the fringes of the political reality of the State of Israel. Certainly some organization already existed and had maybe an agenda and ideas, but in general, you wouldn't see them operating on the ground. So we move from an idea to real operation on the ground. So cultural memory has become a reality. And given the current context where you also have individuals in the government of Israel or part of the elected members of Knesset, so the chambers of Israeli institutional setting, it feels that this has become more than the work of some, but also some sort of a centralized directive. So part of the state itself rather than an organization. And I was wondering if you have a similar feeling. And at the same time, given this is a practical issue, if you think that in the future, whether near or far, actually this can be undone.
The undone question, I'll get to that in a second. I don't know if I have an answer for that, but I think absolutely, well, it's helpful to look at Elad's origins. When Elad came into East Jerusalem in the late 80s, early 90s, its founder, his first project was actually a housing development. And they tried to promote building 200 units over the archeological site, which tells you very much about the organization, right? First, what their real intent were and continue to be, as well as how much they actually care about the archaeology. But I think it's interesting because when they started advocating for this project, they were thrown off the stairs of every governmental agency, right? So the municipality objected, the Israeli Archaeological Authority objected, and at that time, the Israeli National Natures and Park Authority was not involved yet. And they were considered a bunch of kooks, right? That have nothing to do with archaeology or heritage. That, to their credit, and I say this because they know they have pivoted since very effectively, they saw that they were not able to promote their original goal of building housing for settlers, so they pivoted to heritage, right? They thought, okay, we can kill two birds with one stone. We can tap into the sentiment of strengthening Jewish heritage in East Jerusalem, in Jerusalem in general, on the one hand, and also be able to gain territory that way, even if we won't win the demographic battle. And what has happened since is that Elad has been able, and its founder and current and still CEO, David Ve'ali, have been able to essentially weld themselves and mesh themselves, weave themselves into every lever of power that is available to them in Jerusalem in particular, but on a national level as well. So over time, they became, even though in the early days, the Israeli Archeological Authority strongly objected to Elad taking over the excavations. Over time, because of the neoliberalization of the IAA and the basically unlimited funds Elad was able to enjoy through private donations and governmental grants, they became one of the IAA's biggest clients, paying them for a salvage dig. And over time, what we have seen is that relationship has turned from advocacy to extremely close collaboration. Same thing happened with the Natures and Parks Authority and the Jerusalem Municipality, where we see in the 90s and early aughts resistance, objection, and dissent. We now see extremely close collaboration to a degree that some scholars have theorized it as a proxy organization, right? That we shouldn't see Elad as separate from the state, but rather a sort of private arm of the state that is able to do things the state can't do, whether legally can't do, or financially is incapable of doing, or there's not the political will to do it in this particular way, but this organization can actually do these things, yet still enjoy very much the support and infrastructure and investment that comes from the state in that sense. So it's state by proxy. And I think that is very much visible, maybe we can talk about this in a bit, with the enforcement of Elad into the Hinnom Valley, where if in the city of David there is even the sort of ability to claim that it has something to do with archaeology, and the archaeology itself is actually quite interesting, and is a real object in the Hinnom Valley, there's actually nothing, and we just see how this increasingly close collaboration between the Parks Authority, the Antiquities Authority, and Elad has led to a quite rapid process of dispossession of Palestinian olive groves in the Hinnom Valley.
I want to ask a question about terminology before we talk about other aspects of your work, because I think they're important. One is your relationship with the term settler colonialism. And I'm asking this because obviously it has become a dominant discussions among others related to Israel-Palestine. And recently I had the pleasure of interviewing my good friend Arnon Degani, who has a specific view on the use of the word settler colonialism. But I'm also interested in the question of apartheid. When you were talking about, how we have some sort of let's call it a parastate operations in East Jerusalem, well, it feels that Elad and other organizations are protected by laws that only apply to them and not to the rest of East Jerusalemites, or vice versa. East Jerusalemites are not protected by laws that are protecting then the others. So I was wondering also your relationship with this term. And I understand that these are all very complicated, complex, and they cannot be unpacked briefly. But I'm very curious in your work how these terms play out.
I think for me, settler colonialism is a very useful framework. I think it helps both explain, I'll approach it differently. I think when you start looking at land and land relations in Israel and Palestine, it becomes immediately clear that settler colonialism is the only framework that explains the 100-Year War on Palestine, as Rashid Khalidi calls it, right? Because if there's one thread that ties Zionist thought, Zionist practice, and the state of Israel, and its continuous relationship to Palestinians and Palestinian territory, is the desire for territory, right? And in that sense, I found settler colonialism and Patrick Wolf's writing in particular incredibly insightful and helpful in making sense how to account for exactly what you were saying right now, right? This sort of constellation of para-state, private organizations, the state itself, as well as how people in their everyday lives reproduce this colonial logic. And I think for me, settler colonialism has been an incredibly useful and productive framework in understanding these processes. I understand that some people have problems with it or might think that Israel is not a perfect case study for it. And that might be the case. I still think it's very useful, even if we have to adjust for it. And I think another thing I found very useful in it is its comparative element, where you see colonial logics not only mirrored in other instances like Ireland and India, but straight up or directly imported through colonial networks, right? So if the British implement a policy in Ireland, you can see that policy transferred into the Israeli context, and then the Israeli government sort of models itself after the colonial government of Britain, and you get a continuity in colonial practices. So I find it very valuable. I think there's a lot of unduly objection to it, especially in Israel, but that is more of, as I understand it, political objections, which seems to be stemming out of a lack of desire to recognize Israelis as settlers, right? And maybe a word on this word settler that I think is interesting and important here. There's a tendency in the popular media to think of settlers as only those Jewish individuals who chose to live in occupied territories. Right now, mostly the West Bank, also the Golan Heights, and previously the Gaza Strip, or maybe even in the future the Gaza Strip, who knows. But I think what we fail to understand, if we take 67 as the origin point of who is a settler, is the long process of dispossession that Palestinians have went through, and the massive reallocation of land that happened in 1947 and 1948, right? And for me, settler colonialism also helps understand that in Israel, we are all settlers, right? And by we, I mean the Jewish population, obviously. And not just those who live beyond the borders of 67. And I think when we understand that, we can, and maybe this is sort of a result also of me being from Jerusalem and trying to grapple with this question that you just raised, right? Like Palestinian residents of East Jerusalem enjoy more protections under the law than residents of the West Bank, but less protections under the law than citizens of Israel. They don't get to vote in national elections. They are allowed to vote in local elections, but obviously refuse to do it out of a refusal to normalize the Israeli state. So when you kind of look at Jerusalem, you are forced to reckon with what is it that Jewish settlers are looking to do in East Jerusalem, and why is this happening in places other than the West Bank? And when you accept that this is part of the same framework, the framework for self-colonialism and this desire for land, elimination and replacement, you also start seeing it happening in 48, right? You see it happen in Ramallah, you see it happen in Lod, you see it happen in Accra, you see it happen in all these places in different ways. Gentrification, the advancement of religious schools in quote-unquote mixed cities, and all of these different things, as well as nature administration, that are all seem to be somehow working in unison to encroach into Palestinian territory, erase and eliminate their history in relation to land, and replace it with Jewish settlers and Jewish histories. And the way to understand all of these is part of the same mechanism and desire, even though they operate in such different ways, for me, is through this framework of settler colonialism.
Let me ask a question about your previous career, because maybe many know you because you are an artist, photographer, a filmmaker, but then you decided to write a PhD. And I was wondering what did motivate you to leave or maybe pause that career for a different one?
Um, so I did my undergraduate degree in photography, as well as my master's degree over here in California in photography and new media. And something that has always was of interest for me in my practices through the various mediums such as photography, archival work, documentary filmmaking, and essay films was how do histories or how are histories mobilized to political ends, right? And I was interested in this question of how cultural memory works to solidify, cement, and sediment certain narratives, and how it also works to erase others. And more than that, how these two countering forces or opposing forces have political uses in modern day societies or in everyday societies in our day. So I've always, through my art, investigated this question, right, of history and how history is political. And when I finished or when I went to do my master's degree, I started working with something you and I share, or many scholars of Palestine share, is you come across this collection called the Matson Collection, the American Colony Collection, and I'm assuming you had a very similar experience to me, where you see the photos and you're just immediately struck. First by their beauty and aesthetics. It's just stunning. These were very good photographers. And these amazing pictures that are kind of hard to see elsewhere. I don't see this section of history from Palestine displayed very often, especially not in Zionist education. And for me, it was, so first of all, as a photographer, when I came across these were just striking, technically impressive, aesthetically capturing, and I just wanted to look at more. And I looked at more and more and more and more. And it was 20,000 slides digitized by the Library of Congress. And I essentially spent an entire summer just looking at these images and sort of enjoying their visual aesthetics. But the more I looked, the more I understood that as I looked at this part of history and this land through these eyes that I wasn't aware of, I also realized that there's a story there that I have never been told. Growing up in Israel under the quite normal or sort of normative education system that is mostly Zionist, there was a history embedded in these photos that was quite foreign to me, right? A history, to borrow from Maria Lasley, that I had to unlearn, an imperial history I had to unlearn. And looking at these images helped me unlearn it. I saw a popular anti-colonial struggle from Palestinians, peacefully organizing. I saw a history of collaboration or co-living between Jews and Palestinians. I saw an agricultural history. I saw the history of British colonialism. I saw all these different strands that I could not access through my normal education. And what became apparent to me is that there has been this massive project of erasure, and that led to my dissertation project, which is called Dissident. Sorry, not my dissertation project. That led to my thesis project, which I titled Dissident Images, right, where I wrote explanatory captions about what particular images from this collection represent in what is missing from my own education. And then I was left with this question, right? This question of how do we use historical narratives to oppress other people? And what does it look like when we mobilize this history towards violence? Something I think Israeli society has done quite often. And I didn't have any answers. So I thought, okay, the way to keep pursuing this research and ask these questions is through a PhD program where I would pitch this question of using historical materials for dispossession, initially through an archival lens, and work through that. That ended up being a short-lived project and kind of got transformed into other projects, and then landing with similar questions in the city of David, where in one of my visits to the fieldwork on the Matson Archive and visiting the American colony, I swung by the city of David, which is not so far from there, and was just struck by the way biblical imagery and imagination were mobilized in the site to completely erase and ignore the vista of Palestinian villages that is so evident from there. And those set of questions still linger in my head, right? These are the things that bind together my artistic practice and my scholarly practice, is again this question of how we get trained to, how do we know what we know about history, and how these sets of knowledges then get mobilized in material ways to erase, dispossess, and subjugate other peoples to oppression and occupation, apartheid, and so on and so on.
I have a couple of more questions, and one I want to pick up from your biography, your bio. You served as a photographer during your military service, and I found it interesting that you were sent to document landscape and architecture in the Gaza Strip. Now, between that period of time and today, that has changed quite dramatically. But I was wondering, not only obviously the changes due to the war, what do you think has changed in relations to the use of photography? Is it still relevant operations? I mean, given that we have different kind of technology, where it's drones, satellites, is it still, taking pictures of landscape and architecture part of a military operation? And if it's so, how do you read it? Is that part of occupation, control, or just mapping, or, how is this used? Because obviously it requires good technique, and I guess you also acquire expertise when you can use outside. And also, perhaps you can tell us a little bit about your experience, comparing the time you were in Gaza and maybe the images that you and we see through the media of the same houses, the same places. Given that, as I acknowledged, and many are acknowledging, particularly colleagues and friends from Israel, that not necessarily those who are in Israel, they see the same images that we can see through Western media.
That's a lot, but let's try to take this one by one. So during my mandatory service, I served for 1 year as an intelligence photographer in the Southern Command. And part of my job was to go into the Gaza Strip and document the vistas or landscape from guard stations in order to then take into processing by intelligence officers who would mark the panoramas with various forms of information, right? So overlay them with data about Palestinian life in order to facilitate the work of guards, soldiers, and raids if necessary. And I think when I came into my service, one thing that was very clear is that there's an imbalance between the access to technology, observation, surveillance technology, documentation, photography, and the way it's used, right? So to put it very simply, we Israelis, the Israeli army, could look at them, the Palestinians, but the Palestinians could not look back at us. And that was very much a powerful tool. And in many ways, my political awakening started there, where for the first time I could witness with my own very eyes the toll that colonization takes on Palestinians, right? Seeing very small settlements surrounded by battalions upon battalions of soldiers whose entire job is to make sure that these settlers are quote unquote safe, right? What it actually meant was disrupting the lives of Palestinians and subjecting them to humiliation, violence, harassment, arrests, incarceration, maiming, and death. And for me, encountering that by looking for the first time, by seeing these atrocities committed in front of my eyes, sort of set me on the political path I am on today. And I think that in many ways, the imbalance remains, right? We are seeing to this day the Israeli military deploy in mass drones and surveillance techniques to enclose Gaza, to keep Gazans from leaving, to inflict damage on Gazans. It's technology that has been used most recently in combination with quote unquote or so-called artificial intelligence that relies on visual data to allow, authorize, and execute aerial strikes. Right. So the entire apparatus, the entire war apparatus of the Israeli military relies on the ability to see and observe Palestinian houses and territory, and it's especially true in Gaza, but it's also very much the case in the West Bank. And it's sort of like the panopticon effect in that sense. But I also think we've seen something else emerge, especially around the recent war on Gaza, where Palestinians were able to look back to the Israeli army and show the world for the first time quite effectively, I would say. Up until now, most of these videos have been ignored and the world stays silent, but something happened that this time around, these videos that Palestinians take and capture and disseminate through social media have enabled them to look back at what Israel is committing in Gaza, the atrocities, the war crimes, the genocide that's happening. And for the first time, I think these images receive some kind of a much bigger audience than they used to be. So I think there's sort of a little bit of the unmaking of the balance in access and dissemination of images, but at the same time, I am not sure that that has been translated to, or I'm sure that it has not been translated to a shift in the balance of power, right? Because we've seen that even though more people than ever are witnessing what is happening in Gaza, we are nevertheless have not been able to stop the Israeli and American war machine in Gaza. And even though we're seeing and even believing what we're seeing, that doesn't translate to any kind of political will. Or in other words, even though we were able to expose these atrocities and see them, the shame that usually is associated with this maneuver has just not been there, right? And we weren't, and these images have not been translated into political action. And what we keep seeing or being subjected to are images of more genocide, more violence, more death, more destruction, and nothing seems to be affecting anybody who's in power right now. So that was part one of your question. I forget if there was, what was the other part?
No, actually, you answered the question too. And I just want to throw you a softball, as we say in America, as the last question. I'm curious about your artistic career, whether the PhD will take over or will keep producing short movies.
when I entered the PhD program, I was very optimistic that I could somehow maintain my practice, and the rigor and demands of graduate school have eviscerated any hopes of being able to do both at the same time. But at some point, I started practicing visual anthropology, so translating some of my skills, my photography skills, into field work. And I use photography heavily in my work. I use it to both document the unfolding processes of dispossession, but I also sometimes use it to try and reflect on what are on the field very visual processes, right? So, for instance, when you go to the City of David, all visitors are ushered into this observation deck. And in this observation deck, they are told that this is the quote unquote the place where it all began, right? Referring to the idea that this is the city where the Jewish nation formed into a cohesive political unit. But when you look at what you see, what your eyes take in is a vista of East Jerusalem, a quite beautiful landscape that starts with Al-Aqsa on one side and ends with sort of a valley and then mountains again of every East Jerusalem Palestinian neighborhood, from Abu Tul to sorry, I'm blanking all the names. Wadi Khilwa, Silwan, Abu Tul, Ras El Amud, Jabal Mukaber, and all these different neighborhoods are just laying in front of you. And I think the question then became for me, how is it that so many people walk into this observation deck looking at East Jerusalem but feeling as if they are in Jewish Jerusalem? And part of what I do with photography is try to document moments in which people are taught how to see. They're sort of inducted into what Goodwin calls a professional vision, right? They learn how to process incoming optical information through cultural, political frameworks. So their perception is not the same as their vision. So I use both the insights from photography as ways to understand my work, but also I use it to try and provide some kind of insight to people who haven't been to these sites on how these sites look and feel and how people move around them, because I think the bodily experience, the visual experience are actually crucial elements of how cultural memory works as dispossession in these particular places, right? Because they allow people to have the feeling of being in a Jewish space while in fact being very much in a Palestinian space. And then the other thing is that I wanted to get back to doing essay films. I think I miss the associative freedom and the creative liberty that the visual and artistic mediums provide, and sometimes is stifled in academia through a need to speak a very particular language, use a very particular lexicon, and often the need for discourse, which I appreciate in of itself is a great tool, ends up stifling, I feel, some of the creativity that things like writing and filmmaking and photography offers us in other ways.
This was Yair Agmon, scholar and artist, director of short movies like Our Heroes, The Arrest, and Once Upon a School, and author of an upcoming article with the Jerusalem Quarterly, From Wasteland to Eden, on temporality and the political ecology of East Jerusalem. Yair, thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to support the podcast, please share it with others on social media or leave a rating and review. To catch all the latest, follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook @Jerusalem Unplugged. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.